Hey, Steve Saretsky here. Welcome back to the show. Lots to touch on this week. As we mentioned in last week's video, Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister of Canada, can he fix Canadian real estate? We're going to get into some of that, some of his policies that are now being announced, some big updates to that. We've got the BC government coming out and saying some dramatically different things about the housing market, the rental market, as it rolls off a cliff, kind of pulling the obvious 180 here. So, now, Mark Carney is expected to announce an election on Sunday. You're probably watching this video here on Saturday, so is expected Mark Carney will call an election. And so, again, we're going to be covering a lot of that on this channel along with the Loonie Hour. But there are times where I, generally try to stick out of politics because it's kind of a losing proposition, not only on the money management side, but on the business side. Someone as myself that's running a business, you have clients sort of on two different political spectrums. So you do your best to sort of keep this objective view of government and of policymakers, but there's times that I feel I need to speak up, and clearly looking at the polls, it's telling us something. This is going to be a very, very close race, and so I look at this chart that was circulating this week by economist Trevor Tom. He's he's a very neutral type of economist, and he put out this chart showing on GDP per capita in the OECD over the last 10 years. Now, again, the Liberal Party has governed Canada over the last 10 years. Canada is at the very, very bottom of the OECD for GDP per capita. There's been no growth. This is literally what they call a lost decade in Canada. And I find it incredibly difficult, at least morally, to provide the party that governed over this lost decade rewarding them with another 4-year term. To me, seems morally wrong. I can't stomach that. So hopefully people sort of look and say, look, you're changing the head coach. You got rid of JT, you changed the head coach, but the players on the team are all the same. The management's the same. Nothing has changed, just the head coach, and you're expecting different results. So we're going to get into a lot of the policy decisions that are coming up. But I think it's important to talk about Canada and the policies moving forward. Now, you look at voter intention. This is very much a story of housing. You look at who is likely to vote for the Liberal Party at the upcoming election. It's clearly skewing much older generation in Canada because they've been insulated by these policies, right? As you ramp up immigration to 1.2 million per year, ramping it up to 1 million people a year in this country, obviously, and not building enough housing for them, that has boosted asset prices for, let's say the boomer generation that owns their houses typically free and clear, and has really created a crisis for the people sort of sub 45 years and younger. And so you can see through voter intention, just exactly where the votes are going. And so there's been a cohort, again, that I feel has been insulated and actually has benefited from a lot of the policy measures over the past 10 years, despite the lost decade that we just talked about. The lost decade is really for the younger generation. As you bring in 1 million people a year, it ramps up, it drives wages down, and pushes shelter costs higher. And so that has been a dramatic change. And so if we look at, finally, there's been some reforms to population growth from Immigration Minister Mark Miller, which we've talked about on the show. Canada's population growth last quarter was 63,000 quarter over quarter. The same quarter last year was 270,000. So again, we're still growing. We're still growing. It's going to be a challenge to get those non-permanent residents growth down, but they are slowly leaving the country. And population growth is returning to a healthier, normal baseline. Now, again, what is the path forward? I don't necessarily know. I am always skeptical saying that things are going to dramatically change, particularly when you read in the news today that Mark Carney has just added the founder of the Century Initiative to his advisor board. The Century Initiative is basically Canada should have 100 million people by, I can't remember the year, 20, 40, 50 years out, they should have, 100 million people. So these people are obviously responsible for the initiative to try and ramping up excessive population growth. So we'll continue to watch that number moving forward. But again, the wheels are in motion. Population growth is slowing. That's why we're seeing the decline in rents pretty much across the markets nationally in Canada. We've got some of other Carney's policies that were announced this week is the removal of GST on new homes. Again, he said for any first-time home buyer, if you're buying a home under $1 million, you'll be exempt of GST, saving you 5%. This is basically the same policy that Pierre Poilievre had announced 2, 3, 4 months ago. Again, on homes under $1 million. There will be no GST. Now, his was across the border, not just on first-time home buyers, but secondary home buyers, investors, etc. So that was sort of across the board. So kind of mimicking the same policy. And so, sort of speaking of mimicking the same policies, is we've seen, of course, the Carney government coming out and saying, okay, it was no more carbon tax. We're removing that. We're going to keep the industrial carbon price on, of course, which is really just a secret tax that you just won't see. But it will still very much show up in day to day. And following that lead was David Eby of the BC government, where I'm located here. So, funny to see that the BC government now is unwinding that after 17 years of having a carbon tax. They're going to remove the consumer carbon tax. They're going to keep the industrial carbon tax on. But if you're following that news cycle, remember the BC government announced a $10 billion record, $10 billion deficit that is expected for this coming fiscal year. And so with the removal now of the carbon tax, they're expecting that to worsen the budget by about another $1.5 billion. So that is blowing out. So the BC government's deficit is blowing out. There's going to be more and more taxpayer dollars that are going to be used to servicing the interest payments on that debt. And that is really cause for concern. And so the BC government is now finally, ironically, starting to panic. And what are they doing? They're actually trying to go back to the well, or the golden goose, so to speak, which is real estate. Remember how much economic activity real estate in British Columbia drives, not just from a direct property transfer tax revenue, development fees, etc., but the economic impacts of that. When people are employed in the construction sector, out there earning wages, obviously they spend it on different things. People are transacting homes. They go and buy new furniture, hire lawyers, mortgage people. So the economic spin-off impacts of real estate is significant. So when you have this sharp downturn as we have today in the BC housing market, that then impacts government tax revenues. That's why we saw them when the budget deficit was announced, they ramp up the BC speculation tax. So the species speculation tax is going to increase to try to offset this massive deficit. And now Eby is saying, okay, pre-sales are rolling off a cliff. No one's building new housing. It's no longer economically viable. Tenancy laws are so restricted that people don't necessarily want to rent out, their basement suites anymore to long-term tenants. How do we basically reverse the outflows of capital? How do we get capital back into the BC market, and particularly back into housing? Remember, the BC government wants more housing, not less. So how do we attract capital when you've basically enacted a lot of policies that penalize capital? You remember, you ran a whole campaign on getting these speculators. They kept calling them, we need to get the speculators out of housing, but you need speculators to invest, ironically, in pre-sales. Pre-sales are what they call a futures contract. You're buying a piece of paper and expecting delivery of said product 3, 4, 5 years down the line. That is the definition of speculating, is buying a futures contract. So you need those speculators to get construction financing, to sell the pre-sale units, and to deliver the housing. So you actually, ironically, need the speculators to deliver the supply to the end user market. And so Eby was now out this past week at a conference with a bunch of realtors in Victoria saying, quote, I will read it verbatim, "The shadow side of the work that we've done to address investment in housing is a lot of the existing real estate model around pre-sales, and everything else was built around the idea that people were buying pre-sales and flipping them, for example, as well as other kinds of links between investors and actually building housing." And so one of the things that we're looking at is, how do we harness that energy around investment, especially at a time when we're looking for investment in the province and the interest in investment going into housing and real estate, and do it in a way that facilitates access to more housing for people. So the premier said he's actively working on such a program behind the scenes to, quote, channel people's desire to make money buying and selling properties into a more constructive mechanism for the government. In other words, how do I attract capitalism? And so this is really the irony behind a lot of these policy measures, not just the federal level, but at the provincial level, sort of pulling these 180s and saying, okay, maybe we need to remove carbon taxes. Maybe we need to remove the proposed capital gains inclusion rate. Maybe we need to slow the roll of clamping down on housing investment and clamping down on tenancy laws. So again, this is really all the things that we chatted about on this show. Is really just playing out in real time. Evie talks about attracting sentiment into, it talks about bringing investment into the housing market. Well, it's pretty hard to do that when consumer sentiment in Canada is at all-time record lows, even at the depths of the pandemic in 2020. So again, what's clear to me moving forward is that you cannot arrest economic gravity. We're going to continue to see a decline in new housing starts, and none of these projects, very few of them are economically viable. Developers don't want to take the risk in today's market. Sentiment is sour, particularly, obviously, this is elevated by the tariff wars that are happening, despite the Bank of Canada, of course, cutting rates, which, of course, leads us to CPI inflation. That pushed up higher than expected. We've been talking about this. The weaker dollar, the weaker loonie, combined with tariffs, is going to put some inflationary pressures back into the Canadian economy, and that could actually arrest the Bank of Canada's ability to continue to cut rates. And we saw that with the latest CPI reading is certainly going to give Tiff Macklem an extra pause here into the April meeting. As of right now, markets are not pricing in a rate cut in April, so it's something to continue to monitor. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. People that are actively looking to buy real estate today, or actively looking at a refinance or a renewal that is coming up, should be looking and at least hedging their bets and locking in mortgage rate holds. Worst case scenario, or best case scenario is you've got this rate hold in place. Maybe bond yields push up in two months from now, and worst case scenarios, you've already got your rate hold in place. So again, no, it does not hurt you to hedge your bets, get your rate holds in today. There's so much volatility in the bond market. It's not something you really want to be playing around with. So as always, guys, hope that helped. Again, the big election that's going to be coming up, I think it's incredibly, incredibly important. Obviously, as it impacts the housing sector that I play in, the younger generation that I deal with quite frequently. It's going to be a very, very interesting election. Again, regardless of one's political views, we'll continue to sort of touch on the data points that matter, and we'll see you next week.